John, that was a great way to kick off our presentation tonight. We're starting to fill up. We've got about 75 people in, and if you want to play us for another minute, otherwise we can say some hellos and see how things are going and see who's here tonight. That was beautiful.
Oh, well, thanks. I'll go another less than a minute here.
All right, that's perfect. That'll be perfect.
A little different.
Great.
Sort of something that reminds me of the ocean. Will you be my lead? Standing there on the shore, look over the stormy sea. Or maybe be a selkie to come to rescue. When the storm is over and calm is on the sea, will you walk upon the shore and come to search for me? Find me there among the storm's debris, curled up like a cow, naked for all to see.
Hello, John. Welcome. That was fantastic. You know, I've always called you the rock star. Usually referring to you as a rock star whale researcher, but here it turns out it was a premonition.
Well, thanks to all of you for tolerating that. I had told Diane that I was wanting to integrate some kind of music at some point into a presentation, and partly because of a unexpected weekend spent at the ER and the hospital, I didn't get a chance to prepare anything, so I thought I would just try to wing a couple of relevant original tunes with some made-up words. But thank you for entertaining me on.
Well, I think it was beautiful and perfect, and we are happy to be the launch pad for your new presentation style here. You play with us anytime. Well, welcome. We've got a bunch of people saying hello. We've got folks up from Bodega Bay so far, and lots from the Los Angeles area. And we'll continue to see where else some people are chiming in from. But in the meantime, I want to welcome everybody to our May edition of the Deeper Dive presentation. My name is Diane Alps. I'm with the Cabrillo Marine Aquarium. And let's go ahead and take a quick look at what we're doing tonight. So our Deeper Dive monthly webinar has been really fun so far, investigating the lives of whales and other marine mammals. And this program really started, it was launched from our Cabrillo Whale Watch program, which is a 51-year program, a long-term partnership between the Cabrillo Marine Aquarium and the Los Angeles chapter of the American Cetacean Society. I just also wanted to mention, we've got people from all around the West Coast logging in, even inland, a little bit from Bakersfield, lots of Central and Northern California, and spanning all the way down to Baja California Sur. So really excited, spans the reach just like you do. So I think at this point, I am going to drop my slides and let you go ahead and take it from here, John.
Okay, that sounds great. And, whenever I look at the participant list that we have, like the current one, there are a lot of you that are very experienced with some of these species. And so my challenge is always including enough background for the people that might be newer to it, but enough new things to make it interesting for the old hands that are among you. So hopefully that'll work out for you. I'm mostly going to focus on three of our long-term study species, humpback, blue, and gray whales, and primarily humpback and gray whales this time. I'm going to kind of leave blue whales are going to get fairly short thrift, but they'll get a little coverage. And I'm going to focus a little bit about some of the long-term studies and some of the new results that have come out of it that maybe will surprise you. I'll bring in a little bit of stranding data and other major events that have occurred with some of these species. The photo ID work, part of the excitement of my work is that we have some elements of our work like photo ID that we started doing in the mid-1980s. And photo ID is this, great tool that becomes more and more insightful as you build up a larger catalog, a higher proportion of the population identified, longer sighting histories of animals, and then weaving that with what might be new technologies that become available that open up things maybe you've wondered about for 30, 40 years that all of a sudden you have the ability to look at. And I love that combination. Just in the photo ID, you'll be seeing, I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of different aspects. We heavily use photo ID for abundance estimation, for the PCFG gray whales, for the Eastern North Pacific blue whales, and for the U.S. West Coast humpback whales. Our mark recapture estimates using photo ID are the primary ones used by NOAA in their stock assessment reports. And there have been some kind of neat new developments in all of these. I'll try to bring up a few of those as we go along. So that's one of our goals. Another goal is we try to look at the migration and movements, especially as certain species like humpback whales are now recognized as having different distinct population segments under the U.S. Endangered Species Act based on where they breed. And each of those separate distinct population segments has its own unique endangered status. Central America, humpback whales are treated as endangered. Mexico humpback whales that breed in Mexico are treated as threatened under the US ESA. And Hawaii humpback whales are fully delisted under that. So that's made it important as we deal with things like ship strikes and entanglements to try to understand some of these movements and interchange that turn out to be fairly complex. We're also increasingly using our photo ID work to look at aspects of follow-up of either entangled animals or calculations of survival. And oh gosh, I don't think I've updated this table on the bottom left. It's still it's actually a year out of date. Our humpback whale encounters on the U.S. West Coast is now over 100,000, heavily fueled by the involvement, expansion, and participation of large numbers of people through Ted Cheeseman's Happy Whale platform. And that's, dramatically expanded the number of IDs. We work closely with Happy Whale. I think we're one of the first groups to share some of our survey information and IDs and kind of seed as effort initially in 2015 for the US West Coast. So it would be more beneficial to people to contribute, that they'd be able to link to some of our history of sightings, as well as, tap into this huge wealth of identifications that are obtained by groups in different areas, whether that's Monterey Bay Whale Watch in Monterey Bay, or some of Peggy Stapp's work, or Aquarium of the Pacific out of LA, or the Channel Islands Naturalist Corps out of Santa Barbara. Those have been incredibly valuable in building this up. But you can see for each of those species, we have tens, and in the case of humpback whales, hundreds of thousands of encounters, and a catalog that numbers between, in the kind of mid 2000s to up now over 7,000 for humpback whales. Since I mentioned this is a year out of date. Thanks to Happy Whale and the matching algorithms, we've been able to stay more up to date with this. Okay. The work we go out and do, we tend to do from these small rigid hull inflatables, and we try to cover as much of the U.S. West Coast as we can. For example, here you see two of our rigid hull inflatables on the left. The first panel that you see that's right in the middle shows our small boat tracks for the small boat surveys in 1 year, in this case, 2018. And as you might guess, 2018 was a good year. It was a year we worked closely with Southwest Fishery Science Center and were able to survey a good portion of the U.S. West Coast following up a NOAA ship survey. The panel in the middle shows our humpback whale sightings, and the panel on the right showed where we collected some 300 samples from humpback whales. We don't normally collect that many samples, but it was part of a big push for that year alone. So that's just a little bit about kind of our effort. And now I'm going to jump into a little bit about the different species. And this slide is kind of the most complicated because I want to sort of introduce three elements of gray whale occurrence that I'm going to talk a little bit about each. So you'll find a little bit of a test to keep up with which one I'm talking about. We have an overall Eastern North Pacific gray whale population that used to be fairly well defined in terms of breeding areas in Mexico and feeding areas in red up here in the Arctic. This has now gotten a little more complicated with how do the Western North Pacific gray whales fit into that, especially now, both with photo ID and satellite tags. A number of the animals from the Western North Pacific have been identified coming into the Eastern North Pacific and to the Eastern North Pacific breeding areas. But we'll focus for now on our Eastern North Pacific breeding population, what Elisa was talking about monitoring from Palos Verdes. These are the animals that breed down here in Baja, then make this migration, some crossing a little bit offshore, some traveling coastally and moving up into the Bering Sea. The second group I want to highlight is, and that overall Eastern North Pacific population, and I'll show you some numbers in a second, but numbers in the 20,000+ animals was typically considered one of the success stories of a population recovering from whaling. A much smaller group of that, called the Pacific Coast Feeding Group, summarized on this slide as PCFG, occurs in this area highlighted in green and occurs from Northern California up on into Southeast Alaska, with their densest areas being really from Eureka in Northern California north up to the northern end of British Columbia, but they are seen in other areas. But that population only numbers about a hundredth of the overall Eastern North Pacific gray whale population. And it's become a very important population for debate, partly because it is more loyal to our area. It ends up spending time feeding from the spring through the summer and fall, with some animals even overwintering. And so it's much more potentially vulnerable to human threats like entanglements or ship strikes. And it's become a major debate issue in terms of the resumption of the macaw hunt. Third, I'm going to highlight the Sounders gray whales. And these are a group of initially 6, then it turned into 12, and now we're up to 20 gray whales that depart the migration, come all the way into Puget Sound. This is Washington State, an area of northern Puget Sound, and end up spending 3 to 4 months feeding in that area before continuing their migration north. So they're not like the Pacific Coast feeding group, though we do have a few of those animals that will occasionally join these Sounders gray whales and feed in that area, but mostly they're animals that then continue the migration. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that group, maybe more than any of the other groups. As part of our stranding program, and this is, an important element of the gray whale story now, has been this high unusual mortality we've had starting in 2019. And I'm going to focus here for a second on Washington State, and some of my perspective is going to be that way, but I'll show you some of the larger context for this. This figure shows the annual number of gray whale strandings in Washington State. And Washington State is kind of a nice example because we have generally fairly accessible shores. There's some areas that are tough to get to. And we've had a fairly active stranding response effort, at least for whales, going back to the 1970s. So we have pretty good effort over the time. And you'll see a couple of things from this. First of all, you'll see there's some pairs of years where there's this very high, by far exceeding the more typical 4 to 8, or 4 to 6 animals we get that wash up dead in Washington State. And you can see 1999 and 2000 was one of those years where between the 2 years we had 50 gray whales. And then you'll also see that 2019 was this huge spike that has decreased a little bit since, but still has remained well above normal levels, hovering around, 9 to 13. And keep in mind, this last bar is 2022. So it doesn't yet include the whole year. That bar is going to rise as we go through the year. So that's an incomplete year. And you can see most of these strandings in Washington State occur generally, and this is by month of the year, from April through June are our 3 peak months. So we still have another peak month to go in our main mortality period. And that coincides with a couple of things. That's the primary period. Gray whales are migrating past the Washington coast on their northbound migration. It also represents the tail end of their seasonal fast. So it's when they might be at the lowest level of nutritional status. And, any problems they're facing and getting enough to bide them through the winter would start showing up most acutely then as they migrated north. Now, this phenomena has not been restricted to Washington State. It's occurred along the entire range of gray whales. And the figure on the right is actually taking just a couple of years of the most recent UME and plotting the locations. These are data from NOAA. And then you'll see a couple of tables. The top left table being mortality from 2019 to 2022. And 2022, in this case, was only through 6 May by country, Canada, US, Mexico. And then you'll see in the lower table, it breaks down the different US states that we've had. And that's why you see 5 for Washington, but we're actually now up to 10 because this is a little more out of date. And these numbers will certainly climb for 2022. This has, I would say, been the subject of considerable discussion, and I think there's broad, agreement of some of the factors that are involved, but maybe we haven't quite been able to put it together in a way that makes cohesive sense or understands how big each of these parts is. And these are abundance estimates gathered by Stewart and Weller in a NOAA Tech memo from 2021 based on the NOAA shore counts and the estimates they've had. And you'll see some kind of striking things from that. One is you'll notice there's a decline in their estimates around 1990, which interestingly coincides with one period of elevated mortality we observed in Washington state. And then it dropped again in 1999, 2000 in that previous UME. And now we've seen another big drop after the between these counts that were done before the 2019 UME and this count done in 2020. So certainly it looks like these mortality events have major consequences that go beyond just the number of observed mortalities. In fact, I think that the proportion of gray whale mortalities that actually are documented as strandings on the shore are probably down in the 10-20% area. And this is part of analysis we've been working on with Rob Williams and some other people to try to quantify this. But either way, we know it represents only a small portion of the true mortality. And certainly the fluctuations and the drops in these estimates that you see after these mortality events tends to confirm that. Now, some of the considerations in this UME, and I'll just mention a few of them. It'd be fun to kind of talk about these even at more length, but I'll put out what are some of the important points to me to keep them in context. One is that the Eastern North Pacific gray whale population was at record levels, prior to this most recent UME. So overall, the population has done well. One thing that's worried a lot of people is that there have been dramatic decreases in ice cover and changes in the Arctic ecosystem where most of these gray whales feed. And that has sometimes been tempting to make a very kind of simple connection between that and these gray whale UMEs, but it doesn't seem to hold up quite as well. And some studies that have been done by some of the Southwest Fisheries Science Center researchers going back to before this UME actually reveal that years when there were lower ice cover in the Arctic, actually gray whales seem to benefit and have higher calf production in subsequent years. So there's a certain way that lower ice benefits them, but that's just one part of the equation. Some of the work that Jackie Grebmeyer working with Sue Moore have shown that with these changes in the Arctic, some of the common areas gray whales fed in the northern Bering Sea where prey was abundant. Now prey is not as abundant, it's gone down. So there's a combination and prey abundance getting lower in some of the traditional areas they feed, but the lower ice cover has also opened up broad new areas that they can access and try to feed than were accessible to them before. And they can access them sooner and stay there later. So that's why it's a complicated picture on that. One thing we can get a little encouragement from is after the 1999-2000 UME, which was quite dramatic, the gray whale population did fully recover from that. And so, I got a bullet point that's out of date there. Sorry, my bad on the next to last bullet points. Basically, I showed you some of the stranding numbers that they dropped in 2021 and 2020, 2021, and 2022 compared to where they were at in 2019, but they still remain elevated. And you have to wonder how much of that drop is also partly due to a lower gray whale population, lower number of calves that often have lower survival rate, and other factors like that. Okay. I know that was a bunch of stuff to cover. I want to mention that one of the things we've noticed is in these years with high mortality, we also see a lot of emaciated whales coming into Washington state. These are both some of the dead whales we have, but also some of the live whales we see swimming around. Sometimes they're, at least in a dead animal, their girthiness can be deceiving because when they bloat, they can look very girthy, and you have to more judge it by the condition of the blubber layer, and particularly the lipid levels in the blubber layer. One little interesting thing I see now that I know Lisa's on, one thing that surprised us a little in the last couple of years has been we have seen more strandings of gray whales the last 2 years of gray whales that had been attacked by killer whales, and where killer whales seemed to play a role in their death. It was pretty typical for us to see animals with old killer whale rake mark scars, but where it hadn't threatened their life. But now we're seeing animals chewed up or with the tongue ripped out, that have had a much greater, likelihood of playing a major role in the death of the gray whale. And that's been puzzling us, because gray whale attacks by killer whales on gray whales certainly isn't new. Monterey Bay has been one of the better areas that's been studied, and Nancy Black has documented that in much of her work. And certainly it's been documented in Alaska, especially around the Aleutian Islands. But for us in Washington State, it was not as common. And for now, the last 2 years, we're seeing about a third of the animals of the gray whales we're documenting dead have show signs of having been killed by killer whales. That's puzzled me a little bit, because, as we mentioned, there seem to be fewer, and as Lisa alluded to and been confirmed by some of the Southwest Fisheries Science Center data, there are fewer calves, and they are a primary target of gray whales, but still we've seen more of these evidence of attacks. I found it very intriguing. I think I recognized some of you were on the talk that Jared Towers organized, that had some of the Australian researchers talking about the huge uptick in killer whale predation, primarily on adult blue whales. But in the context of that talk, they were talking about the rather surprisingly large number of humpback whale calves that were being killed by killer whales in that area. And I almost wonder, if we're not seeing a little bit of an expansion of killer whale predation as populations like humpback whale populations have recovered and there are more calves. Maybe that's promoting more specialization on going after large whales. I'll be curious in the chat afterward what Elisa thinks about that. Okay, I mentioned the macaw hunt. That's something that occurred in 1999. The macaw proposed a resumption of their historical hunt. That still remains, it was largely put on hold due to some legal suits. NOAA has now issued an EIS on the hunt, and it may be something we'll see resume in the near future. And I believe the macaw management plan, but I don't think this is necessarily finally decided, will call for alternate years of trying to hunt springtime migrating whales and maybe one PCFG whale in summer in alternating years. Now, we've focused on the status and abundance of these Pacific Coast Feeding Group gray whales. And this is our long-term trend that we've worked on with the Marine Mammal Lab in Seattle, initially with Jeff Lake, and now with Peter Mahoney, who's been running some of these numbers. And you'll see that especially this scale tends to kind of blow this up a little bit since it doesn't go to zero. But actually, you can see from about 2002 on, the PCFG abundance estimates have been pretty steady around 200 to 250 whales. And they don't seem to be having the same kind of fluctuations or downturns associated with the unusual mortality events. Unfortunately, it was right at the start of our research in 1999, 2000. But if anything, it looks like our abundance estimates took an uptick immediately after that 1999, 2000 UME. And so we're interested to see, I think these whales are facing a very different set of circumstances and pressures and feed on different prey and habitat. So now switching a little bit more to our Sounders gray whales. I mentioned these are whales primarily seen in March through June, and then they generally disappear. It was 6 whales starting in 1990 and 91. It became 12 whales after 1999, 2000, right after that UME, and now it's expanded to 20 gray whales. And these are whales that feed primarily on intertidal ghost shrimp. I'll probably jump over this. We've been doing a bunch of different things with these whales, so I don't want to get bogged down in them. We've been not only documenting the individuals and dates of arrival, departure, we've been looking at the data that would help assess their feeding on ghost shrimp through suction cup tag deployments. We've been able to quantify that their feeding rate. We can actually quantify each pit they create. There have been several studies that have tried to quantify how much prey they remove from each feeding pit. And this represents a somewhat unique study site that we've looked to expand in recent years with a partnership with SR3, with John Durbin and Holly Fernbaugh, as well as a partnership starting with Hannah Clayton, who started working with us last year, and now will be starting her PhD program at the Goldwogan Lab at Stanford, and will focus on the Sounders gray whales. But what's kind of exciting is in no other baleen whale species can we measure all the parameters that we can with the Sounders gray whales. How many whales, how often they're feeding, how much prey they remove from each pit, and how does their nutritional body condition change over time. And I'll show you a little bit about how we've been able to do that. We've used a variety of techniques. You can actually plot and look at some of these gray whale feeding areas in Google Earth, where there are Google Earth images that are taken in spring at low tide for this area of northern Puget Sound. And we did document that starting in 2019 and after, the number of these pits and the areas they use expanded, and could do that with the satellite images. Here you see our record going from 1990 to 2022, so now spanning more than 32 years. Each row represents an individual. Columns are years. We do have the sex and the name of the animal. And if it's a green box, it means the animal was seen that year. If it's a white box, we didn't see it that year. If it's a purple color, which you'll see, those are a couple of animals that are PCFG animals that have shown up in the northern Puget Sound in some regions. One of them become a regular there, but were previously known as PCFG whales. And those purple boxes indicate they were seen in the PCFG area, not necessarily this northern Puget Sounder area. And I think I'll come back to one element of this that will maybe become more important, but let me show you a couple of other slides. When we started to wonder, well, what would drive whales to depart and come over 100 nautical miles off their migratory pathway to try to discover a new feeding area, and what represents a very high-risk feeding area, an intertidal area that they can easily become stranded at low tide, in which they can only access at high tide. And I think we have an insight on this, and the answer is desperation. And I think if you can see these shaded bars, basically the more solid bars are the bars I showed you earlier of the number of strandings. And then if you can make out these shaded bars that are high in 1990 and 91, are high here in 1999, 2000, and then creep up here in 2018 and 2019. And basically those shaded bars are telling us what years did new sounders join this group. And it perfectly lines up with these years where the animals were facing a nutritional deficit. So that's why I say it's desperation that had to drive them. Some of the research Hannah's been doing, we've done some additional deployments. We are now focusing a little bit more on gray whale calls and deploying acoustic tags. So we're excited to expand that in coming years. Our work with John Durbin and Holly Fernbaugh has taken the methods that they've used really successfully with southern resident killer whales and some other species, and now applied it to the Sounders gray whales. And it's revealed some interesting, surprising, for example, these three panels, and I'll just maybe draw your attention to the first two panels on the left there, which are taken just 2 weeks apart. And you can actually see the animal is girthier in the middle photograph and still girthier in the right photograph, just over these short intervals of time. So clearly these whales are getting a huge payoff. Not all whales show this gain, especially some of the new whales don't, but most of them do. When John and Holly have have looked at their multiple measurements of the same whales, you can see most of them are climbing, especially for our regular animals, and only a few have shown declines in that. They've also been able to use this method to identify likely pregnant animals. And partly that's from seeing that their girthiest area in apparently pregnant females is further posterior on the body, which you see on the right panel compared to the animal on the left. And those animals seem to engage in very heavy feeding. Whale 22, which is named Earhart, she was one of the pioneering initial females, is kind of one of our long-term favorites. And so she, I think, is one of the people one of the whales that pioneered this method. Okay, I'm going to skip over this. I'm going to mention we deploy tags, and we did that last year, and we'll be continuing that as well next year. I'd love to show you some video from those, but I'm going to skip over this for now and just say that these tags have revealed that these whales seem to only be feeding during these high tide periods. Largely, there are some exceptions. This is a 37-hour deployment on one of the gray whales, and you can see the tidal cycle superimposed here, and it only fed here, 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 and here, each coincided with the rising and high tide. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about humpbacks because, gosh, time just flies on by.
It is, but you know what, John? We have a couple questions. I have a couple questions, and since we're doing these changing species, can we pop in for a couple of seconds real quick?
You bet. Go for it.
Well, so I have a couple questions about the prey. So, I mean, they're going 100 miles, like you said, out of the way, and they're feeding primarily on ghost shrimp up in the sounders?
Yes.
And what's the nutritional value compared to amphipods?
Well,
that would be their primary prey.
Yeah, and I skipped one of the slides. I didn't put it in this talk, but that has been measured by some of the past researchers. Though that's something that Hannah will be looking at, actually doing, calorimetric measurements of that. But some of the prey density, biomass of prey per square meter is higher in these intertidal areas than has been documented in their primary feeding areas in the Bering Sea. So you can easily see that even accessing it for part of the time could be really beneficial given that higher return. But there are some other trickier stories about the ghost shrimp. One is they are longer lived than some of the amphilicid amphipods they feed on in the Bering Sea. And there was early speculation that those amphipods would rapidly recolonize areas, and maybe even some aspects of gray whale feeding, would promote that. It may be a trickier story with a species with more like a 3 to 5 year lifespan. And we do see gray whales, the Sounders gray whales, concentrating their feeding in different areas year to year. And especially as the number of Sounders has increased, we are wondering what that will end up looking like. Right now, it looks like they're not maxing out or getting close to the max biomass of ghost shrimp available. But none of those calculations have fully brought in what's really accessible to them. So there's some uncertainty around that, and that'll be one part of the work that Hannah will be doing.
Interesting. You talked about your stranding response up there, and of course, Cascadia. You cover a lot of the strandings. Is it all of Washington, or how far do you guys cover?
Yeah, Jesse Huggins, who is our stranding coordinator, we have a dedicated response area that includes Puget Sound and portions of the Washington coast. But for large whales, we try to get involved in all strandings responses in Washington, working with some of the other teams that are primary responders in certain areas. And so that's allowed us to keep a fairly continuous data set. And it will be my presentation topic at the Marine Mammal Conference in August. I'm planning to give a talk on the long-term trends in gray whale strandings in Washington State and insights from it. So I'll be going into more detail on that for that talk, for those of you attending that in person or virtually.
It strikes a memory when I kind of first met you or really got to know you was a conference in Seattle when you were scheduled to be on in the afternoon, and we hadn't seen you yet, but heard you were on a stranding. And as the conference coordinator, I was a little worried, thinking maybe you'd get busy, knee deep or deeper in a whale, of course. But no, of course, being John, you came rushing in. still freshly reeking of, stranded whale.
Yeah, that was a fin whale, actually.
Oh, that was a fin whale.
It was a fin whale. It was the ACS conference held in Seattle that year, and that turned out to be in a year of high fin whale ship strikes. We actually had 4 or 5 fin whales that were either killed or dragged in by ships into harbors in the Salish Sea that year. And it was one that had washed up and that we had managed to examine up near Bellingham. And I'm not sure. Some people remember it fondly and others remember it not so fondly, because I think by then I was totally unaware of how bad I smelled, but a number of people commented on that afterward.
It did fill the hall, but I felt like it really brought us a little bit closer to you, John. It made us really embrace who you were. But I also remember thinking about how much you, were dedicated, not just in, the research component of being out there and responding to a stranding no matter what, but also following up with the public outreach and still attending the conference. So I was grateful, but I also was fascinated by, this crazy man walking in smelling as you did. We do have a question, a bit more of a comment, from one of our attendees that said they would still like to see the videos. You did pop over one of your videos. I think it was a humpback tagging video. Yeah. But they appreciate seeing the videos, and especially as they mentioned, a little easier to grasp and understand. So there's a request to see those, which I'm sure you'll probably have more. So hopefully we'll see those. All right. I think that's it for now. And I'm going to go ahead and pop back off and look forward to the next segment.
Yes. And I'll probably pick up the pace a little bit now, because I'm not as far through as I should be. This is just our humpback whale abundance trend for California and Oregon, based on 3 different mark recapture models. You see a 4th line there, a very smooth line. That just represents a 7.5% annual growth rate. And you'll see that that's about what humpback whales have been doing along the U.S. West Coast, especially off California and Oregon. And for me, it's quite dramatic, because the first estimates in the late 80s, when I started working with humpback whales, were around 500, and now we're around 5,000. So 7.5% adds up over the years. And so just in the time I've been studying humpback whales, that's resulted in a 10-fold increase in humpback whale abundance. Quite the success story, but also creating some new challenges, which I'll touch on briefly. We do treat the Washington and southern British Columbia as a separate feeding area. It's also shown a dramatic increase. What's interesting is that this has not been the story in necessarily all feeding areas in the North Pacific. Some of you may be familiar that some areas like Southeast Alaska actually showed quite a dramatic drop-off in humpback whales that occurred that seemed to be associated with some of the dramatic changes in ocean conditions that occurred. With those increases, we saw a dramatic return of humpback whales to Puget Sound and what we call the Salish Sea, and that has continued. And you can see that chart. Here's where the IDs come from. And if I go to this, I'll just bring up a few numbers. We've now confirmed at least 755 unique humpback whales have come in and used the Salish Sea. So it's a pretty heavily used area. And that's out of, that represents about 50%, about half of all of the humpback whales we've identified in Washington and southern British Columbia. One of the things that I mentioned, the impressive results that have come out of efforts like Happy Whale. And one of the more impressive ones has been the large number of humpback whales that now have been matched to known winter breeding areas, and getting at that distinct population segment question. And you can see in this first, we have matches of over half of these whales, either from the Salish Sea or from Washington and southern BC. Sorry, I didn't generate a Southern California-centric analysis. It would have very different proportions of matching. What was interesting to us is that with this population increasing, we have quite a few younger animals where there hasn't been much opportunity to identify them on the breeding grounds. And if you make some selections, like only whales identified over at least a 10-year period, you get all the way up to 78%, or over 3/4 of the whales identified had been whales that we knew the breeding area for. So one of the impressive things that's occurring with this huge increase in participation and the streamlined way that some of the matching algorithms have sped that up. In the case of the Salish Sea, it showed us that humpback whales in those regions, let me see if I can go back. Yes, there we go. Are kind of almost equally split between going to Mexico and Hawaii, with only a small portion going to Central America. Our previous studies, and I think we have a paper in the works on this, show that that proportion of animals going to Central America increases as you go south. So it's highest in south central California, where it is a substantial number. And a recent paper by Alex Curtis, I was going to throw in a few figures from the tech memo that's about to come out on this that we're a part of, has now come up with a solid estimate of the number of animals using Central America, the first one since the splash days, and showing that's around 1,000, a little over 1,000 animals. I did want to mention a little bit about an effort now. A lot of the previous calculations of humpback whale migration rates and overall abundance throughout the North Pacific were based on a study we did in 2004 to 2006 called SPLASH. Well, the exciting thing is we're now doing SPLASH 2. And it's sort of kicking off along with that SPLASH 2 effort. We formed the steering committee. We have quite a few collaborators interested in participating. NOAA has also funded some expanded surveys in Central America and Southern Mexico in 2021 and 2022. And so that's been really exciting. I'm going to skip over some of these. Sorry to do this to you guys, but these are the various goals of the SPLASH 2 study. I'll just point out that the effort in Central America and Southern Mexico has involved a number of collaborators working in those countries that we've been able to support and fund in 2021 and 2022 to expand that coverage. And that effort was quite successful. For example, in 2021, we identified 350 individuals, and that exceeded the total we identified in all 3 years of the SPLASH study. So it was quite successful. The numbers from 2022 are not up to date yet. We will be close to that number for 2022 as well. Okay, a little bit about blue whales, just to say their populations are older data, especially when we based it on more limited mark recapture estimates. And it came from the 1990s, through the early 2010 period, mostly tended to show a fairly constant, not really changing abundance of blue whales. But now, most recently, our abundance estimates have hinted, and with some of these earlier estimates and using a new mark recapture model that includes capture probability varying by time and individual, which we've found gives us a pretty reliable estimate. It now does look like some of our blue whale abundance estimates are increasing. They were a little bit lower than we thought they were, closer to 1,500 in the 1990s and 2000s. And now, most recently, they are closer to that 2,000 to 2,500 number. It gets a little busy, so I didn't show the slide, but what's a little crazy about this is the line transect abundance estimates that NOAA does from their ship surveys have shown an opposite trend, with higher numbers in the 1990s and lower numbers in the 2000s and 2010s. And we think that reflects just a different thing that those two estimates are measuring. The line transect estimates are measuring the average density of blue whales along the US West Coast. And our estimates are trying to estimate the overall population. And so what we think this means is that the overall population has been doing okay. but the proportion of animals and how much time they spend feeding off the US West Coast, we think has gone down. But we're really excited. We're working with a new graduate student from the University of St. Andrews, Georgie, that will be looking at some other elements of this to see if we can find some verification for this finding, because it's a little bit troubling to have your two main population estimates give you opposite trends. So I'm still a little disturbed by that. Let's see, we're after 8 o'clock. What do you think, Diane? Can I go maybe 10 more minutes?
Yes, please.
Okay. I was just going to mention threats to large whales. I'm going to focus on one related to entanglements in fishing gear, where we've been doing a bunch of new work, and I wanted to mention that. So mostly I'm going to focus on this first one, but there are a number of other issues with whales. One of the things that, when you talk about the entanglement issue that, some people bring up is, well, entanglements couldn't be a big threat if the population's increasing. And there's some validity to the fact that right now we don't have strong evidence that it's, causing a decline in the number of animals, but the number of entanglements and the number of ship strikes are still substantial. And those are human impacts that I think we have a responsibility to try to reduce. This is from NOAA's West Coast office, showing confirmed entanglement reports from 2002 through 2021. And the main story you'll see here is that starting in 2015, there was a dramatic increase in entanglement reports. And that word reports is kind of like what I mentioned about strandings. Reports are a function of not only how many entanglements are occurring, but who and how often they're getting reported. So it's something we've tried to work with SCAR studies to try to find some independent validation that some of these trends aren't changes in reporting frequency as opposed to changes in actual entanglements. And I'll show you a little bit about that. But you can see this increase, the primary, primarily was contributed by increases in humpback whale entanglements, with the primary identified fishery being the commercial Dungeness crab fishery. And that's been a reason, both in Washington State and Oregon, and most actively in California, there have been Dungeness crab fishery working groups trying to find ways to better deal with entanglement issues. There have been a number of fishermen working hard on this. The state of California got sued and had to also take over a more active management of closing the fishery, when there were threats of larger whales, and that's part of what some of our surveys played a role in. And it's tempting to think there's some sign of improvement in this trend, but there are many factors that go into entanglements, not just the reporting frequency. They're whether the humpbacks are concentrated closer to shore, especially when they feed on fish, or more at the shelf edge when they're feeding on krill. We wrote a paper with Jared Santora that talked about the marine heat wave and how that influenced things. So anyway, a number of factors are at work here. In our stranding data from Washington State, we have seen a steady increase in the proportion of strandings that showed indications of entanglement. So we do think that that's one other piece of data that shows that is something that is increasing in occurrence. We're active members of the disentanglement network, especially up here in Washington, and have gotten involved in some disentanglements in recent years. When we're in the right place at the right time in California, we try to help out on that and have on a few of those. This is that paper I mentioned about habitat compression. I think it represents one piece, but not the only piece of the increase in entanglements. One of the studies we've been doing with the Marine Mammal Center and initially SR3 has been to do dedicated surveys. These were initially funded by the Ocean Protection Council to inform the presence of whales immediately before the opening of the Dungeness crab commercial season in mid-November, as well as in spring when they debate whether to continue the fishery into the summer months. So our approach has been to conduct surveys to look at not only how many whales were in the area, but whether they're using primarily inshore areas along the 70-meter contour or more along the shelf edge, where they'd be more out of the area used by the Dungeness crab fishery. We use photo ID to document how many whales are using the different areas. We do studies of the prey they're feeding on. We do some tag deployments. And these have resulted in these kind of plots. What you see here is a plot of some of the survey lines we conducted, which were a combination of those transect lines along the 70 and 200 meter line, as well as some opportunistic effort. In this case, red showed humpback whale sightings, and blue showed blue whale sightings. And these sightings in fall, which were in October and late October, stretching into getting close to the opening of the fishery, resulted in the last 2 seasons in the Dungeness crab and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife delaying the opening of the Dungeness crab fishery. And there are also aerial surveys. Karen Forney, working with some of Nancy Black's Monterey Bay Whale Watch data, also does a metric. There are a number of other metrics that are used. California Fish and Wildlife is trying to do some of their own aerial surveys. So there are a number of approaches being used to inform, these decisions, but it has resulted in the delayed opening of the start of the fishery and often the closure of the fishery in spring prior to summer, either due to whale numbers, though this year something even stranger occurred. I'm going to move on a little bit, sorry. In that we actually had documented entanglements that occurred early in the season, particularly in the Monterey Bay and Half Moon Bay area, that resulted in a closure of the fishery even ahead of our springtime surveys. So there is a tracking of that. So sorry, I'm going to skip over a few of these things. And I'm going to, let's see, how are we doing? We're almost at my 10 minutes. I'll just say these SCAR studies that we've been working with several graduate students on, Annabelle Wall, who has a manuscript in prep, looking at the spatial degree of presence of entanglement scars on humpback whales, showed that even though a lot of entanglement reports come from Monterey Bay, if you look at the proportion of humpback whales that show entanglement scars on them, it does not vary that much. You can see along the coast, it only varied between 11 and 16.6%. So it suggested humpback whales in other areas, and for us particularly relevant areas like Oregon and Washington, probably face a similar risk of entanglement, even though we get very few reports because it's a much wilder coast. There are fewer people on the water. The weather is much less favorable, and we don't have the presence of the kind of as active and informed the whale watch effort as occurs in areas like Monterey Bay. The second study conducted by Allison Payne, an SFU graduate student, was looking at how entanglements had changed over time. And even though the sample size was a little smaller than we liked and we need to expand it, it did tend to verify that there were higher acquisition of new entanglement scars after 2015 than before. Okay, and I think I'm just going to maybe go to this slide. It might be my last slide, just to come back to certain points on ship strikes, which I barely covered, but I just want to point out there have been some very active efforts up and down the coast looking at ship strikes and trying to make changes. If any of those people are on this call, especially the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary and Sean Hastings there, and Michael Carver up in the Cordell Bank Farallones area, they've really tried to take on this issue. Sometimes they hear my frustration because largely these efforts have been either voluntary or incentive-based to try to get ships to slow down. My hierarchy is move the designated shipping lanes more than we have to avoid areas of whale concentration, shift transit routes along the coast. And here's a funny thing that may be an interesting benefit of alternative energy. There are new proposed alternative energy lease areas off California and Oregon that are along some of these transit routes that the ships take going between U.S. ports. And Kirsten Flynn, one of our researchers, who's also a licensed captain, has done ride-alongs on these ships and documented that the encounter of whales is that the much higher proportion of the encounters occur outside these designated shipping lanes and along these transit routes. Fortunately, now the U.S. Coast Guard, and I think partly influenced by this, the potential development of offshore wind and wave energy, is now looking to reconsider these fairways that the ships travel on, and it's added a new incentive to reconsider those, and could be a really positive way to again separate ships and whales. And to me, that's the primary strategy, which is the first two of these. And then I do think slowdowns have a role. I appreciate the success that efforts that have been undertaken to create incentives or report cards, like what the Beniaf Whale Safe program has tried to do. I always keep feeling like, why not just make them mandatory? Part of my argument has been, I've had shipping company people tell me, we don't take your voluntary measures seriously because you don't, otherwise you'd make them mandatory. But anyway, I think there's more that can be done on those. Okay, and I think I'm going to call it there since we're after 10 after, and I'll stop sharing my screen. And sorry to have jumped over some things.
Before you stop sharing your screen, not only because we had a specific request for it, but because I always think it's just some of the coolest stuff too, is do you have a handy tagging video you can share?
Yes, I'll go back to this one here. I did call out most of my tagging videos, but I had left one in that I was hoping to get to, and I'll go to that one. Good. And it is one that is, sorry if this is driving you a little crazy here. Here it is here. So okay. I'm going to go to that, and I have to do a couple of things here to get it back up and centered. And this is from a deployment in Monterey Bay that we did a number of years ago of humpback whales feeding with a mixed group of California sea lions and quite a number of seabird species that you'll see come into view. The video starts with two images of the deployment. This is James Fallbush on the bow of the boat. I'm driving the boat. This is James's view, kind of calling out what he's seeing. And this is my view that gives you the context. I'm trying to very gently creep into this group of humpback whales because there are a lot of whales here surfacing unpredictably. And so I kind of want to catch a trailing animal in the group and not risk, getting in the middle of something that would not be beneficial to them or me. And here are whale surfaces right in front of us. That's the tag going on. And now we switch. This particular tag has a forward and backward facing camera. And this is the unedited first 2 minutes of that video. And on the left is the view looking forward on that camera, so towards the head of the whale. And this is the view looking towards the tail of the whale right after we tagged it. Kind of looks like the skin of a gray whale, but this is a humpback. This is the antenna from the VHF transmitter you see trailing here. And right after we deploy this tag, this whale actually approaches a school of anchovies. It's actually, you can see the head comes up as it angles up into the school of anchovies right there. And actually, you can see partially breaks up that school, takes a mouthful, but then almost collides with another whale. There's actually some vocal behavior by the whale, grunting as it comes almost into contact. One of the things that struck me about this video, but we've had a hard time proving, now you see some of the seabirds picking off some of the stragglers. And I think there are ways that the sea lions and seabirds are serving to mutual benefit. Seabirds would often, would clearly benefit by some of these dense groups being broken up so they could individually pick off anchovies, and the humpback whales would benefit by them being as concentrated together as possible. And I just came away from this thinking, man, I don't want to come back as an anchovy in this kind of setting. And you'll see the sea lions darting into the picture here, often in the wake of the whale on the right image, and they're picking off some of the anchovies as well. You see some dead anchovies going by. We'll go through maybe one more lunge. And this was, I said, the first 2 minutes of unedited video. Here a whale has to kind of maneuver around. He actually has to abort the approach of the anchovy school. Again, does a vocalization. And now right here, you'll see on the left, there's another whale already that just took a mouthful of the anchovy school. So again, he has to pass that up. I was going to say part of the picture that emerged for me was that there's some competition going on here. So here the whale sees its opening, goes by one whale, and now gets another charge into the anchovy school right there. And you see another whale has just taken a mouthful as well. And you get a little bit of a picture of that. And now, again, some of the seabirds picking off some of the individual anchovies. Okay, there we go. That was largely it.
Incredible. Before you get out of your slideshow, somebody noticed that there was, I know, I keep doing that. Somebody noticed that there was a little audio click on one of your gray whale slides. Do you have gray whale calls in there?
I do. It's not a particularly impressive gray whale call, I'll tell you, but I'm happy to go back. And I don't know, could you hear any of the sound on that last video?
No.
Okay, then I think that might be a wasted effort. I think I have to enable sound sharing. And apparently once I do that, it chops off a little part of my screen. So the last presentation I did that I enabled sound sharing for that reason, it cut off part of my captions. So this time I didn't do it.
I've seen that as a problem in Zoom. Yep. Well, we do have some good questions, and I have a couple of questions I'm going to start with because the moderator's choice here. So with your D crab surveys, the Dungeness crab surveys, you mentioned that because of your survey work, it has caused the closure, the early closure of the D crab fisheries. But did you mention or have you noticed yet if there's been a decrease in entanglements because of the closures?
Well, entanglements are always tough to monitor. And I'll point out that, there are a number of survey efforts informing this, not just ours. You will notice that annual slide of annual entanglements showed that peak in 2015 and it's declined since. And it's just the status. I'm always a little weary to attribute that to these efforts, but certainly it's been a promising development. And I have no doubt that some of the measures that have been taken, delaying the opening, some of the best practices the fishermen have entailed, and reducing the continuation into the summer. The peak of the Dungeness crab fishery is in the winter months. So it is very convenient that their most lucrative, best time to fish, is the best time that conflicts the least with whales. And to whatever degree that can get more focused on that, I think it's beneficial. But as I said, this past spring threw many of us for a loop with all the entanglements that occurred. Some of the slides I skipped were an attempt I was making to try to understand why we had such entanglements in February and March. And if anything, it didn't come up with a clear answer. We had assumed the wintering animals were primarily juveniles. But looking at past data and even the years from this data, the entangled animals were mostly juveniles. But when we looked at all the animals that have ID'd in winter months, it was a pretty broad mix with less than half of them were juveniles. So if anything, it made us think, well, it's not quite as simple as we thought it was. So we're still trying to understand a little bit better what happened this spring.
And you briefly mentioned the wind energy. So there's been a lot of talk about wind energy development offshore Central California. What, if any, effects do you think that would have on whale populations?
Well, with structures offshore and with cables and power and sound, you have the prospect of noise generation, and entanglements, the degree to which they can limit the lines and keep them taut. You could probably reduce some of those. I actually, because I really wanted to see this decrease in ship strikes, I made the point to BOEM, and hopefully they'll take advantage of it, which is, well, whenever you cover the impact of your activities on whales, you can probably chalk up one benefit, being that if it moves the cargo ship traffic further offshore and out of the whale areas, you'll actually have one benefit, that will operate and could be beneficial. How to evaluate the magnitude of those is something we're actually trying to understand better and will be a key part of some of what's going on now in the short run.
So the cables for that will be shallow enough that it would impede ship traffic? I would think it would be dropped all the way down.
Well, I think, some of these, wind farms or wave energy farms would be large complexes of separate stations, and you would not want ships, going through those areas. So that's why I think they're trying to separate those as being the ideal measure. And with ships making long transits along the coast, to angle further offshore and transit further offshore can actually be done with fairly little, added cost or mileage. So it actually is, I think, a very favorable, way to try to improve and reduce ship strikes.
If there's an upside, that's good. That's good. Lots of good comments about that video, and it is exceptional. That video is amazing. And I think that's on your Cascadia's YouTube page.
Yeah, something I've not promoted much, so it only has, it has small numbers of views. So please go there. There some of the gray whale deployment videos and some of the gray whales feeding on ghost shrimp videos are also there. You just either have to find. There are videos from the Hawaii research that Robin Baird does. There are a number of different things, but if you scroll down, you'll find some of these videos on these video tag deployments as well.
Yeah, that one's a pretty amazing one. So let's see. Jody from Monterey has a question. She asks, how do you decide where offshore you conduct your surveys?
Yes, well, it was a bit of a debate for us as it related to the Dungeness crab fishery, but that's where we decided to focus on contrasting the 70 meter to the 200 meter lines, because 70 meters represents the inner end of where we've seen some high whale densities and also represents a potential area of overlap of high Dungeness crab fishery activities. So we wanted to focus on that as one of the areas that would represent a high overlap area. And then the 200 meter would represent the more favorable area. Humpback whales and blue whales were in that area. Then they would be largely outside of the depth range that the fishery operates. So that's why we chose those two as our effort. And in some way, it was a bit of a toss-up whether to do a more systematic survey of all depth ranges, but we wanted to sort of focus in on what we thought was the key question, if you will. If we only have these limited number of surveys, how can we use them most effectively?
Excellent. Thank you. We have a question from Ryan from Newport Coastal. Thanks for joining us tonight, Ryan. So I'm going to read this. It's a two-part question. Given the data continuing to confirm healthy growth rates and population levels of Mexican and Central American DPS humpbacks, does that warrant the ESA listing upgrading or downlisting the threatened and endangered status? That's part one. I want to go ahead and take that.
And I have, Ryan, nice to hear from you. And thanks for all the communications on the water when we've been working off Catalina and other areas with some of our other projects. And I would imagine eventually the answer will be yes, but I have not heard of direct plans to do that. And I do chair the North Pacific Scientific Review Group, and I think we would hear about it if there was anything afoot. But so not that I know of, but obviously the goal is to better understand it. So far, the main goal of some of the DPS determinations has been how, if most of the entanglements are on the feeding area on the U.S. West Coast, how do we attribute those to a DPS? And this is kind of a neat, there's a paper submitted by Barb Taylor and Karen Martine, and I'm a co-author on that, brings up this concept of almost like managing humpback whales as herds, which means you treat in common the humpback whales that share the same DPS and feeding areas, even though they might intermix on those feeding areas. And that's a way you can sort of apportion those out. But it does create, a challenge. There was a recent paper that Jim Darling was a senior author on that had a paragraph I struggled with at the end that kind of brought up song sharing and some of the long range movements that have now been documented with happy whale, and so wondered whether we should abandon our DPS or separate unit analysis of humpback whales. And the main point I've made to Jim and others is that that would be a far more dangerous and far less conservative way of managing the fishery. The more you pool everything together, then the more entanglements off California wouldn't matter, because it's out of a population of 30,000 across the whole North Pacific. So what does 100 entanglements matter? And the more you manage in these smaller units, where depleting that unit could actually affect the status of the use of an area like Central America by whales, is a much more precautionary way to proceed. So far, that's why, even though it's messy, these DPSs and how to link them to feeding areas, I support it because it has that added precaution to it.
And it had that benefit of being able to show some positive conservation efforts when they were able to downlist many of the different DPS. So I think that you defined it, but just a quickie for people who aren't familiar with the acronym, can you just give a quick DPS review and how many populations there are? Did you talk about that earlier?
Yeah, and in the DPS review for the North Pacific, there are 4 different DPS units: Central America, Mexico, Hawaii, and the Western North Pacific. There was some debate over even creating a 5th one, because in our original splash study, we know there's some areas somewhere in the West Central North Pacific that have not been a part of studies around the Marianas and now are getting studied as a part of more recent research. But right now, those are the 4 recognized in the North Pacific. And there are, I believe, 14 recognized worldwide.
And those are distinct population segments, and those are based on the breeding grounds.
Yes, and unfortunately, they're based on the breeding grounds, partly because DPSs are a construct of the U.S. Endangered Species Act, and in the U.S. And other distinct population segments have focused on breeding grounds. Okay. So that's why there was kind of a favoritism to select them based on that. In some ways, it created an awkwardness, because when we used to manage it by feeding area, at least then we were estimating abundance and number of takes in the area where the primary threats were occurring. And now we have to do this added step. But it also, as I said, makes sense from another standpoint.
Sure. So the second portion of Ryan's question, kind of expanding that question to blue whales. On West Coast blue whales, if NOAA were to recognize a DPS, specifically one for West Coast blue whales, do you think the science would support them being listed in any particular, endangered, threatened, or unlisted?
Yes. Well, blue whales are listed as endangered worldwide. So all of their statuses are endangered. And at least in how some of the populations are being assessed in the North Pacific, they are currently divided into 2 groups, an Eastern and a Western North Pacific group. And the Western one is maybe a bit of a misnomer, because the Western one is really Western and Central. And the most distinguishing feature of those 2 populations that makes it easy to separate the 2 is they have very different and distinct vocalization patterns, especially the broadcast calls the males produce, as very kind of stereotyped for Eastern North Pacific and very different for Western North Pacific. And that served as a great proxy. In the old recovery plan for blue whales, it actually talked about there being other potentially extirpated blue whale populations in the North Pacific. But some of that data has been hard to put together, and I'm not sure everyone's convinced of that at this point, especially since I don't think there's modern evidence of that. Some of the uncertainty around blue whale population status, though, does involve some of the occurrence of blue whales down in low latitude areas, because we have blue whales that use areas of the Costa Rica Dome down at 5, 6, 7, 8 degrees north latitude. And there have been some matches to the Galapagos that are on the south side. And there's also evidence that blue whales occurring year round on the Costa Rica Dome. And that's raised some questions about how do those populations interrelate? Is there a year-round population on the dome? There's been only limited work done on the dome. So I think there are definitely some uncertainties and unanswered questions on blue whale population structure.
Jody posted a little bit of a follow-up to her previous question about how you locate or determine your survey areas. And she's curious as to why specifically the 200 meter and maybe not 150 meter or 300 meter contour.
Yeah, and it mostly stems from the fact, at least off the California coast, once the shelf edge starts dropping off, there's actually often very tiny spatial difference between what would be the 150 or the 300. You're almost covering that similar area, if you will, because usually that's the area of steep drop off that occurs, and some of the upwelling driven krill abundance seems to occur in that zone there. And in our studies of whale densities, when we plotted it by depth, that's where we tended to see a definite kind of peak, if you will, as at 200 meters, though most of that associated again with krill feeding. But, I used to have a very simplistic view. Okay, humpbacks feeding on fish. They're more inshore, anchovies, close to Monterey Bay, feeding on krill. They're more at the 200 meter, but we've found so many examples to contradict that. In some really big anchovy years, the anchovies are everywhere in shallow and deep water, and you'll have humpback whales near the shelf edge feeding on anchovies. So we've kind of learned it's a little more complicated a picture, than that simple link between prey and depth.
Excellent. And she gave a confirmation. That helped answer her question. Aaron asks if blue whale numbers are increasing by your count, but spending less time in the areas surveyed by line transects, do you think they are feeding in new geographic areas? Yes,
and I think the main challenge, and there's sort of a fascinating, I keep wishing I included more of this in my talk, because we have this really interesting contrast between humpback and blue whales along the US West Coast. Humpback whales show what I would call greater loyalty to specific regions, not locations. We get lots of, interchange, but they show much more versatility in their prey type. Fish versus krill and switching back and forth. Whereas blue whales are more exclusively krill feeders and move much more readily over broader regions that extend well outside that area that NOAA does their surveys. We did a paper a number of years ago describing how in one of the years where there were these sightings, this is going all the way back to, I think, 2005, where there were a bunch of sightings off British Columbia and in the Gulf of Alaska, some of them by surveys we did off British Columbia. And we ended up identifying many of the whales we identified up in those areas were whales we had typically seen off California feeding. And here they were feeding in areas well outside of the area that we normally study them and what would be outside of those other surveys I mentioned that were coming up with that decline in abundance. And the same could hold true for whales feeding in offshore southern Baja or down on the Costa Rica Dome. So there are a number of areas that blue whales could go. They are definitely much more free to move, if you will, to search out prey concentrations than what we typically see with humpback whales.
Thank you. And we have an interesting question. Mark and Patty ask, Happy Whale has cataloged photo IDs. And they're wondering if there's any work to catalog any sonic IDs, any of the calls of humpbacks or blue whales, or their voice prints or calls of any nature.
Yeah. And I know there have been a number of studies trying, and I'm not necessarily even up on this literature, looking at some of the unique aspects, especially with dolphin calls, or with a number of species. As it stands right now, those large baleen whale calls have been more stereotyped. And almost because they're stereotyped, there have been a couple of notable exceptions, but they represent exceptions. And that includes what was called the 50 kilohertz, the 50 hertz whale, that Watkins first identified. And if some of you saw, there was a film on the loneliest whale that came out a little bit ago that even focused on some work we did trying to go to some of the areas. And that whale likely represents, we think most likely represents a possible hybrid between a blue and a fin whale, which we have described and published a paper on. We just haven't linked it to that call. So we do know hybrids exist, and we know there's these whales with these in-between calls of blue and fin whales. Is that linked together? We haven't proved that yet. And then there was like a whale with a distinctive call in the North Atlantic they used to call Old Blue that had a signature call they said they could recognize. But as I said, those mostly seem to represent exceptions. And they were notable because they were exceptions and allowed the tracking of those whales. And even though I think the final word isn't in on this, I don't know of any effort to, individually, do IDs by acoustics. If anything, the impressive point about humpback whale song is how it changes, both through the season, across years, and in other ways. So it is constantly evolving. And there have been papers done on some of the calls in Australia that even look like, I believe it was a Western Australian call came into the East Australian population, and then many of the Eastern Australian whales started to sing that call. And I could have that backwards, but there have been examples that just show some of the ways in which one interesting aspects of humpback whales is how they can change their call and learn this new song, and they seem to learn it in unison. And they're probably learning that both on their feeding grounds, because they start calling intensely on the feeding grounds before they start their migration, and then often are singing on their migrations. And it creates this sort of, pathway or transmission of the call. Though to some people like Jim Darling, it's more a symbol that, maybe they're all part of the same population. So there are a couple of different ways to kind of interpret that, if you will. But that individual part, we certainly don't have down yet. I did. I'm not hearing you.
No, that's okay. Go ahead. You were going to finish.
I was just going to say that if you are interested in whale calls, I believe the Cornell Bioacoustics Lab, has a wide variety of calls you can, download and listen to. And there are a number of sites that have calls to hear calls of different whale species. Just do one thing for me. If you're going to listen to a blue whale call, do not listen to it speeded up 10 times, which is what a lot of people do, because then it's more within the audio range we can hear and hear better, or can transmit on a small speaker. But it turns this deep, resonating bass, powerful bass sound into this silly sounding thing that I think just is an insult to the blue whale. I don't understand why people didn't just, maybe you need to speed it up twofold, and maybe you'd still preserve some of the its character.
That's what I was going to follow up and ask. So it's two. Do you think like a 2 times increase is best?
Yeah, or try to listen to it. If you listen to it with headphones, and often when I do presentations and play blue whale calls, if they have a good subwoofer or bass system, it'll transmit well, unaltered. And I think that's better. And you may be hearing more of the upper harmonics, not necessarily the lowest frequencies, but you still get the feeling.
Okay. All right. Well, we have gone well past the time that we had begged and borrowed of you. Thank you so much, John. I appreciate you. I appreciate your time. I appreciate all you do for whale research and all you do for the whale community. I think you've really made research accessible in leaps and bounds, not only with the research community by your ways of collaborating, but also the way you make it accessible to naturalists, to anybody who has questions, to all the public. I think you do great work, and I admire you, and I really appreciate you. We look forward to seeing you guys again next month, and thank you very much for taking a deeper dive with John Calambokidis.
Thank you so much.